We're going to talk about 7 common psychological injuries that we encounter in daily life: failure, rejection, guilt, loneliness, brooding and rumination, loss and trauma, and bouts of low self-esteem. Lastly, we'll look at why and how we should apply emotional first aid to these kinds of common psychological injuries, and we'll look at a few examples of how we can actually do it. Physical injuries impact us, and in more ways than we realize, in surprising ways. So I want to show you how. And I'm going to start with a really common injury: failure. Something we certainly all do. And when I tell people, oh, that's going to surprise you, they're like, no, it's not. I know what happens to me when I fail. I fail, my ego gets bruised, and I get demoralized, and, and my motivation goes, and all of that is true. But failure also impacts us in ways of which we are not aware. It can distort our perceptions, our very perceptions of the goals we have, so that they seem to us to be further away and further out of reach. And that is an unconscious thing. That's an unconscious way in which that happens. But failure can also impact us in other ways. It can also change our perceptions of our actual abilities. I consider failures to be emotional chest colds that become psychological pneumonias, or can become psychological pneumonias: brooding and ruminating. So it's natural to reflect on painful experiences when we have them. It's something we all do. Experiences or worries, we tend to do it. If I play it over and over and over again. And you might think, so fine, so I'm processing my feelings if that's how I'm feeling. I'm talking about it to friends. I'm expressing my feelings. I'm processing them. Sure, let's look at the differences. When you are self-reflecting in a way that is adaptive, what you are doing is you are easing your emotional distress. The whole idea of adaptive self-reflection is that it lowers the potency of the event, so that when you think about it afterwards, it evokes less emotion, it's less distressing. And that happens because by thinking it through, you're reaching new insights. You're seeing things from a fresh perspective. You're learning something. You're identifying actions that you can take to fix your situation. So having those insights and having the idea of what you need to do differently, it all adds up to like a certain release that you feel, and it helps you move on, and you can move on, and it's less troubling. But that's when the self-reflection is adaptive. When it's maladaptive, what it does is it just increases our emotional distress. That's what it does. And the thing is that we used to think that, if you're just getting your anger out, if you're just expressing it, it's a release. So just stewing doesn't help us. And in fact, it makes the urge to keep thinking about it more potent. The idea will flash into your head more often and more frequently and more powerfully. And the other thing is that when we're doing so much stewing and so little doing, it actually makes us feel passive, and it makes us start to have problems with problem solving. We ruminate, we get very, very passive, we see the world in negative terms, so it puts us more at risk for depression, it puts us more at risk for alcoholism because we get angry all the time because we're stirring ourselves up, we have to take the edge off at the end of the day, it puts us at risk for eating disorders because we want to manage our feelings with food, and it also, we're releasing so many stress hormones into our bloodstream, it puts us at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. So that's all of the things that rumination does. And so to me, ruminating and brooding is basically like picking at emotional scabs. You're opening the wound, you're not letting it heal, you're not doing something good. We experience guilt quite a bit. But how much guilt do we experience? Well, in short bursts of guilt, like, oh, I have to call her. Oh, it's an hour now, I still haven't called. But short bursts like that, we can have 2.5 hours a day of mild guilt, 5 hours a week of moderate guilt, and 3.5 hours a month of severe guilt. So that's a lot of guilt, except that guilt is not necessarily a bad thing, because it does something really important. It alerts us, it gives us a warning as to when we might have done or might intend to do something that can cause harm to another person. And that allows us to not do the thing, or to apologize if we've done the thing, or to atone for it in some kind of way. So guilt is a great thing because it really preserves our relationships. It's a relationship protector. And so that's a good thing. Except that when your guilt is unresolved, when it's excessive, that little flashing signal in your brain like, oh, call your mother, doesn't shut off. It just keeps going and going. And that can be an extremely distracting thing. It's a huge mental drain. It impairs our ability to focus and to concentrate. But it also does a bunch of things of which we are often unaware. Sometimes aware, but sometimes unaware, because it turns out our unconscious minds make decisions about how it's going to manage guilt without us, like guilt does. It prevents us from enjoying life. But it does more than that. It actually makes us adopt self-punishment. The name in psychology, it is called the Dobie effect. And the other thing that guilt does is that it makes us really try and avoid the people or the situation or any reminders of the things that we did. It's so toxic to us and so toxic to our relationships, I consider it the poison in our system. Now let's get to the most common psychological injury we all experience, and that is rejection. Rejection are an extremely regular part of life, if you think about it, because, we get turned down by potential dates, we get turned down by potential employers without us, our colleagues don't tell us about the birthday party, our neighbors give us the cold shoulder, our parents don't approve of our lifestyles, our social media contacts don't post our posts and they don't retweet our tweets, and all of it. There are just so many ways in which we can get rejected. But all of them have one thing in common, and that is they really, really hurt. And that's the thing that fascinated scientists at the beginning when it came to rejection. Why do they hurt so much? Why does it hurt so much? So just emotional pain, it hurts people's moods, it makes them angry, it hurts their self-esteem, and this is about as mild as rejection gets. Put people in a functional MRI machine. They wanted to see literally what happens in the brain. And what they found was shocking to them, because what they saw was that the same pathways in the brain light up when we get rejected as light up when we experience physical pain. They were literally overlapping. The rejection pathways were piggybacking on physical pain pathways in the brain. Now, I hope you're beginning to realize that these simple psychological injuries are not so simple, that they really do impact us in very significant ways, that they can damage our emotions and our mood and our perceptions and our thinking and our cognition and our behavior and our mental health and our emotional well-being and even our physical health, because 40% of adults will experience loneliness in their lifetime. We can experience that when we move away to college, when we move to a new town, a new state, or a new country, when we get divorced, when our children grow up and leave the nest, when we retire and we stop seeing our colleagues. Loneliness is something we can all experience, and it damages us psychologically, but physically what it does to us is quite alarming, because yes, like rumination, it does put us at risk for cardiovascular disease and for depression, but it also puts us at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and it also suppresses our immune systems. Isolated, it keeps us to ourselves. So our whole relationship skills and our social skills and our ability to relate and to get into deep relationships, they atrophy over time and they get weaker. And that's why I consider loneliness to be some form of relationship muscle weakness, when physical health is certainly very much impacted by these psychological injuries as well. So now I hope you can see why I was so upset earlier, about why I'm so upset that these things get ignored, that we ignore these psychological injuries, because look at what they do to us. They have such a huge impact on our lives. So now let's look at what we can do about them. And so since we were talking about rejection, let's start with that. I mean, we have time for a couple of examples, but let's start with rejection. Now, remember I said that when it comes to psychological injuries, we sometimes don't even realize we're injured. Not the case with rejection. We know that pretty much very, very well, because we have a strong response to rejection. So let's look at how people typically respond to rejection. So one of the first things that happens is people can get slightly angry or aggressive. Fatal Attraction, anyone? I don't know, you know the movie? So she boiled a bunny and then she came at him with a knife. So you can get slightly aggressive when you feel rejected. The other thing people typically do, when I ask people, so what do you do when you feel rejected? Vodka. They reach for the bottle, or tequila, whatever. They reach for the bottle. Not a good idea. Turns out that when you stuff your feelings down with alcohol, they often come back up again. So that's not going to work. And the other thing we often do is we turn to food. We try and drown our sorrows with food by, hogging the dessert bowl, perhaps while somebody has a sympathetic hand on your shoulder while you're doing it. Now, needless to say, these responses don't really work very well. They don't really do anything for the rejection. They just numb you out or give you a sugar high or whatever it is. So what do we need to do? How do we need to really treat rejection? There are several wounds we need to treat, but the most urgent of them is that we need to do something to revive our self-worth, because our self-esteem just took a body blow. So we need to do something to revive our self-worth. Self-affirmations. And the thing about self-affirmations is they are generated by you. So they fall within the boundary of your belief system because you're the one that has to come up with them. And here's one of the exercises I suggest in the book to revive your self-esteem. I say, and I'm saying it now, make a list of 5 qualities, attributes that you have that you really believe are valuable in whatever the domain is. So let's say it was a romantic rejection. You can write that, I'm loyal, I'm emotionally available, I'm very supportive, I'm really open to all kinds of fun, I'm a great cook, whatever. You make a list of attributes. If it's in the employment domain, then I have a great work ethic, a high learning curve, I'm reliable, I'm responsible, I'm motivated. You make your list, as long a list as you can possibly generate, and then you write a brief essay, 1 or 2 paragraphs about one of the items on your list, in which you talk about why that's important, why you value it, why other people value it, how you've expressed it in the past, how that impacted people, how you might express it in the future. You really elaborate why that's an important thing. And that will actually remind you of self-worth that you actually have. It'll remind you of, you know what? I am pretty much a good bargain for those people to hire me, or actually I do have a lot to offer in the dating realm. That will make you feel better. That the trying to boost our self-esteem is a good idea in general. And this is something I talk about in the self-esteem chapter of the book. Because when our self-esteem is higher, not too high, but higher, it can actually function as a buffer when we encounter things like rejection and failure and anxiety and stress. Now, I'm saying higher, not high, because narcissists, for example, who seemingly have very high self-esteem, it doesn't act as a buffer. You one small insult to a narcissist and they're a puddle on the floor of outrage. So it's about higher, but not too high. And so we know that when your self-esteem is higher, it can actually help you feel more emotionally resilient. And self-esteem is like this armor that you can wear to life that will help protect you. And that's why I consider, and when your self-esteem is low, it's like having an emotional immune system. And when your emotional immune system is low, you're more vulnerable. And when it's high, you're less vulnerable. So low self-esteem is like having a weak emotional immune system. And using self-affirmations will boost it. When our self-esteem is low, we tend to be self-critical and self-blaming and look at all our faults and focus on everything we do wrong. And we are like kicking ourselves when we're down. Now, if you thought of self-esteem as literally an emotional immune system or like armor that you were going to wear to the battle of life, you would hardly see people preparing to wear their armor by poking holes in it and making it weaker. That would not be something you would do. You would think to strengthen it. That's what our self-esteem is. It needs to be strengthened. And so one of the ways to do that, one other technique you can use to do that is the following. When you feel yourself, when your self-esteem is low, and you feel yourself being very critical, and you're feeling bad about yourself, and again, do the following. Again, it's a writing thing, because remember, that's how we absorb best. Write out, if you had a dear, dear friend who was saying to you, this is how I feel self-critical, I feel bad about myself, I'm blaming myself for this, I think I have all these faults. What would you write to them if you were trying to cheer them up, if you were trying to encourage, if you were trying to nurture? What would you say if you were trying to soothe them and remind them of all the great things that they are? Write that out, and that is what you need to say to yourself in those moments. Another writing exercise, it's called adopting self-compassion. And self-compassion is a great antidote to low self-esteem because it reminds you to treat yourself kindly, to allow your self-esteem to recover, to allow your emotional immune system to get stronger again. And if you do, it actually will. So look, I want to talk about the benefits then of practicing emotional first aid, what it can do for you. It can ease your emotional pain. It can restore your cognitive functioning. It can help you think more clearly. It can minimize risks of infection, like we saw with failure, and damage to your long-term mental health. It can minimize risks to your physical health, and it can increase your emotional resilience over time. These self-esteem exercises, for example, will increase your emotional resilience if you do them regularly. I really hope that the next time you experience some kind of psychological injury, you won't just hurt, but you'll try applying emotional first aid. Thank you very much.